Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Giovanna Ceserani. Giovanna Ceserani is a professor of classics and, by courtesy of history, at Stanford University. She is the author of Italy's Lost Greece, Magna Graecia, and the Making of Modern Archaeology from Oxford University Press, 2012. And A World Made by Travel, the Digital Grand Tour from Stanford University Press, just from this year, 2024, and currently directs the Grand Tour project, on which she has also published two co-authored studies, Historical Research in a Digital Age, Reflections from the Mapping the Republic of Letters project, and British Travelers in 18th Century Italy, the Grand Tour and the Profession of Architecture. Her research focuses on the classical tradition with an emphasis on intellectual history of classical scholarship, historiography, and archaeology from the 18th century onwards. A recipient of the Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship, as well as of a Getty Research Grant, she is now the faculty director of the Stanford Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, working to bring new technologies to serve humanistic research. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. And I have quite a few slides I want to share because this is very visual work, both in terms of ancient images, 18th century images, and today's data visualization. So I'll start sharing my screen now. And I hope everyone can hear me well and see well. And I don't have access to the chat now that I am share screening the slide presentations, but Megan, you keep track, right, that everyone can hear and see everything. And Megan, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this digital humanities project. And I'm particularly excited to be here talking about this with you today for two reasons. First is that the work I'm discussing today, the book that Megan mentioned, A World Made by Travel, is published in open access, thanks to a Mellon Foundation grant to the Stanford University Press. So this means that all of it, the scholarly chapters, the database, the interactive features, and the data visualizations are all available to anyone online. And Megan, if you can share the link to the publication now in the chat, that would be great. Because this choice to publish in open access is very intentional and in support of open science in the case of data research and the humanities. So it matters to me deeply to be able to share it with as many people as possible, and I hope you can also help to share it further. So the second reason that I'm particularly happy to be here today is that this is a book about 18th century travels. But I want to say how important it is to remember that classics was absolutely central to these travels. These were journeys, 18th century travels to Italy, to classical lands that were both animated by a desire to explore the classical past and to cultivate the classical ideal. And the consequences of these travels have been very long-lasting, shaping key features of modernity and how we still today interact with the classical past. So it's particularly rewarding for me to talk about this project in its and its publication now in open access in the context of classical humanities that Paideia has been devoted for so long to support and expand. So let me get started. And you can, by clicking on the link that Megan shared, access the book. But I know that one can also get lost into it. So I will mostly have a static presentation with slides, but I wanted to treasure the link for future use. And here you see how this book is online, and that's a screenshot. You have the link there. It's a screenshot of the online cover. It's a book that's dedicated to the Grand Tour of Italy, as the voyages of tens of thousands of travelers who visited Italy in the 18th century were known now and since. And these are travels that in the Age of Enlightenment contributed to a massive reimagining of politics and the arts, of the market for culture, of ideas about education and leisure. So as an interactive open access digital publication, A World Made by Travel, and here on this slide, you see not only the cover, but also when you click on enter, what you get to see as a table of contents. And in particularly of these 6 sections, you'll see that there is one, the Grand Tour Explorer, that is marked by a red border. And if you click on that, it has its own table of contents that you see on the right, because what is at the center of A World Made by Travel is the exploration through a data-driven lens of the lives and stories of 6,007 of these 18th century travelers to Italy. And I emphasize about the number, and I say 6,007 because numbers matter a lot when one approaches 18th century travel to Italy. We actually do not know exactly how many people traveled. There is not an archive of the Grand Tour as such, but estimates put numbers for the British alone in the tens of thousands over the course of the 18th century. But despite this importance of how many people traveled, which is crucial to make this a significant phenomenon, existing studies of the Grand Tour rely on published or manuscript accounts and letters that survived, and thus focus on no more than tens of travelers at most, and in the end up privileging the ones that are better documented. The database that we built at the core of this digital project, the Grand Tour Explorer, instead seeks to reveal the diverse experiences, elite and otherwise, that collectively constituted the 18th century Grand Tour of Italy. So for the time that we have together today, I've structured my lecture into 4 sections, through which, and here they are listed, the 4 sections, and going through these 4 sections together, what I aim to do is to introduce you to the work in general, share some case studies, and throughout I will keep the underlying question as important and active of what might be the payoff of such projects. As you will see, this was a lot of work for many years by many people. And so it's very important to keep asking, what is the payoff of all this effort? And I ask these questions for digital history at large and classical humanities in particular. But let's get started with the first sections, the Grand Tour and the classical world. So first, I want to consider with you, what is the Grand Tour? What do we mean by the Grand Tour? And in fact, the most important question might be, what is that attracted thousands upon thousands of Northern Europeans to visit Italy throughout the 18th century? Dotted with the monuments that these travelers knew from their readings even before embarking on travel of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and populated by influential contemporaries who might be encountered in the flesh, the Italian peninsula held out the promise, for those who visited it, of an educational rite of passage rooted in humanist ideals of classical origins. And this is the journey that already in the 18th century and since we refer to as the Grand Tour. And these were travels that were crucial in determining the centrality of ancient classical art in the founding of modern European museums and in the shaping of European cities' classically inspired architectures, which all provided the backdrop for the age of enlightenment and revolutions that we understand as the basis for the modernity we still inhabit. So if you think of the classical wings of modern museums still today, which display row after row of ancient Greek vases, these type of displays in museums drew their origins precisely from travels in the Grand Tour. And the most significant collection of Greek vases in the British museums, in the foundation of the British museums, came from Sir William Hamilton, and I share the portrait here, who was the long-term British diplomat in Naples, a central figure of the Grand Tour. Everyone who visited Italy also visited Sir William Hamilton at the time in Naples. And you can see how intentional is this portrait by Joshua Reynolds that you see now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, where Sir William Hamilton is surrounded by his beloved antiquities that he collected, and the Greek vases feature prominently both as objects in the picture and as depictions of the figured vases in the book that he's holding. And also very intentionally, the portrait has a window view that is deftly positioned to show Vesuvius in the background, to really signals that this was in Italy, that these objects came from. But also in the explosion beyond museums, also in the explosions of classical architecture that transformed both private houses and the public faces of northern cities in the 18th century, the importance of travels of architects to Italy cannot be underestimated. And I just give you two examples here. And these are two pictures on the left. You see an image of the house museums of the British architect John Soane, which you can still visit today as preserved incredibly well if you are in London. And I don't know if how many of you have gone, or please do go, but this was both a house, the museums, and the architectural study of Sir John Soane, who kind of capitalized on these collections of objects that he put together while traveling in Italy to make the case to his customers and patrons of how he would be, of how important and knowledgeable about Italy he was. And on the, I just want to make, I wonder if I can, I hope that I'm sorry I'm interrupting now, but I don't want I hope that you can see the full screen, and I don't know if instead you get to see me rather. Let me know if that is a problem, because I don't want the images to hide the images of the participants to hide the slides.
I can see the two images that you shared, and then we can
Okay.
also see you.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, then it's working well. Okay, so on the right, I put an image of Somerset House that was designed in 1766 on classical models by William Chandler, who is another of these architects who spent a lot of time in Italy studying ancient monuments and came back to use these models to build new buildings that really embodied modernity dressed in classical ideas. So the list goes on and on. Think of Edward Gibbon and the decline and fall of Rome, and how he recounts how he conceived that transformational work for our understanding of the classical past and ancient Rome in particular, while visiting modern Rome. Winkelmann wrote his foundational history of ancient art in Rome. But there are also many more beyond the famous ones who went. And we know of so many also because of many surviving portraits of travelers in Italy. And when I talk to students about this, I call them almost like the selfies of the time, because these were portraits that were really, the main objective was to communicate to people who would see them back home that you had gone to Italy. And so in the case of in this case, we have 6 young British elite men. They actually were not in Rome all at the same time when this picture was made. So it's a photoshopped selfie, but it's also clearly the monuments depicted in the background, which again, this was not open air painting, but it's a backdrop that is distinctly put there to show these travelers had gone to Italy. Um, so I just spent a few minutes to give you a sense of the importance of the Grand Tour in general in the 18th century and the centrality of classics and the classical past to this phenomenon. But I now want to move to tell you a little bit about how my study of the Grand Tour became a digital humanities project. And I'll start at the very beginning with the very origin story of this project. And it's a story of discovery that took place many, many years ago when I was still a student at Cambridge in England, studying 18th century travelers who themselves were studying Sicilian classical monuments. And I would work on these published books in the 18th century about travels to Sicily. And I found in a library, forgotten on open shelves, a 1773 English edition of the German book by Riedesels, Travel to Sicily. And here you see on the right, the English edition and translation of on the left, the German original. So what was special about the copy that I found that day was that it was an interleaved copy of this edition, and which means with empty blank pages interspersed. And on these blank pages, an anonymous traveler added notes and comments on his own experience of Italy. So there was his original travel and this other commentator who would say, well, actually, I was there and I saw this, correcting and commenting and narrating in parallel his own travel through Sicily. So I'll take you to a specific moment in this travel. And we are here, and that's what I highlighted on the page, on the slide. And you imagine yourself in the northern coast of Sicily near Cefalù, and imagine here a British man who has fallen asleep under a tree in the afternoon heat and is woken up by a menacing mass of locals. And the account includes some very tense moments. It's quite well written when these locals surrounding him seem quite dangerous, but he finally manages to understand that they have mistaken him for a dangerous local robber. And then he also manages with some trepidation to communicate as he recounts, and here are the lines that I've highlighted, quote, and so I'm quoting his words, that he is an Englishman who visited Sicily out of curiosity, natural to travelers. So there is so much one could say here about this passage, about the linguistic and visual misunderstandings between the external visitor and the local people that are contained in this episode. One could also reflect about reading practices and annotations in travel literature, and also this very distilled and clearly expressed sense of a mode of travel that is shared and recognizable, among the British Grand Tourist in Italy, when he says, I'm an Englishman visiting out Sicily out of curiosity that is natural to travelers. But I also want to underline what happened next for me after I discovered this exciting manuscript, because my first question was, who was this traveler? Who was the author of these annotations? And I had a lot of data, meaning I had specific dates and places that were given in this account. I knew exactly the time, the day, and when this traveler ascended Mount Etna, but I had no signature. And so with all this information and this mystery, I turned to what I thought would help me, which was this book that had just come out in 1997, the Dictionary of British and Irish Travelers to Italy, compiled from the Brinsley-Ford archive by John Ingamels. But yet, looking through these pages of this dictionary multiple times, they didn't turn up anyone who would fit the profile. And it was in the course of this frustrating search that the idea for the Grand Tour project originated. Would a digital rendering of Ingamel's dictionary make this search easier? What if I could have just asked, show me everyone who was in Sicily in 1766? And in turn, what else would such a way of searching this dictionary make possible? And ultimately, what might a digital transformation of such a printed work look like? So this was the starting point for a digital approach to the Grand Tour, which is really rooted in the abundance of semi-structured information collected in this 1997 dictionary. Because as you can see also in the images now, some of this is very regularly expressed. You have entries with a name, then biographical information, then information about the place visited by the traveler. So what we did is that we set out to transform these printed entries into digital ones. At first, we did this manually. And then and this is also the slide shows this. And when we just went through and typed every information that we found, finding a way to make it into a database. But then we also moved to adopt a computational approach. And these slides just give you a sense, and we can talk more in the Q&A about this. But basically, this computational approach meant combining several regular expressions and ad hoc scripts to isolate meaningful tokens from the semi-structured syntax of the dictionary that we had in digitized form and transform this into actionable data. This, we can talk more about this in the Q&A if there is time and you're interested, was a very iterative process that yielded a great richness of information on an unparalleled number of 18th century Grand Tourists concerning their itineraries in Italy and their lives before and after the Grand Tour. So here in the slides, you see all the different type of informations that we were able to collect about these travelers and all these various categories ranging from parents' information, marriage, gender, and then education, work, and travel. But what we realized in doing this process of extracting the information from the digitized text of the dictionary is that we started taking note of travelers who appeared submerged into the entries of other travelers without actually having an entry heading of their own. And this is where natural language processing became very important. And we use name entity recognition to extract from the text of the dictionary all personal names that existed. And then we worked manually to disambiguate all these different names to identify all the travelers that existed in the dictionary beyond the ones who had an entry. And this added more than 1,000 travelers that had been previously overlooked. Most of these that we came to call hidden figures were wives and daughters. So let's say if you go back to an entry like this was Alexander Cosmo. He is the heading of the entry. But then if you read the narratives, you find that, for example, his wife, his daughter are mentioned, but did not make it into the entry as a heading. What we did in the database is that we gave an entry to every traveler that was mentioned in the dictionary. And what you see in this slide on top as a dot is every traveler's entry that was already in the original dictionary. And lower, below, you see explorer entries, and there every dot represents a traveler who instead we extracted from the dictionary and didn't originally have his own entry. And you see how many more travelers now we have and how many more of these new travelers are women. So from an original dictionary of 4,800 travelers, of which 200 were women. In the current database, you have 6,007 travelers, of which 955 are women. So if you remember the slide that we saw before, this selfie of these 6 British young men in Rome, if you work with the data that we have in the database and construct a forced network of their relations, you see many more people appearing. You see that all the ones in green are people that are mentioned but do not have their own entry. How many of these are Italians and diplomats? And some of them are even women. So the kind of image that we have in the original portrait of these 6 people get expanded and be populated by many more travelers. What does an entry in the dictionary look like? And I'll start with the one that is always the beginning, the one that we always start with because it's the first one in alphabetical order. And what you see here is that we reproduce in the center for Charles Abbott the original entry as it was in the dictionary, but also that this is flanked on either side by information that is the information we derived from the print entry itself, but formalized as data. So on the right-hand sidebar, you see data about the travels, which is the sequence of recorded dates and place visited. As you can also animate this, and you see the progression of travel in the minimap above. While on the left, you also see all the information that we were able to extract that have biographical importance. So from the original entry. And everything that is here in blue is actionable data. So for example, Charles Abbott was born in 1757. If you click, this is a static image, but if you use it live, if you click on the 1757, you get everyone else who traveled, who was born in 1757. And that starts to allow you to think in terms of generational modes of travels and people the same age being the same place at the same time. If you click on any of the places among travels and visits, for example, if you click on Pisa in 1788, you will get a list of everyone who was in Pisa in 1788. So what this means is that, and I make bigger here, like all the place of travels, you know, and like if you click on Florence 1788, you will see every other traveler who was in Florence at the time. And this is also another way to access the data that you find in the Explorer page, that lets you combine different categories. You can decide to look for birth date, and then of the people that share a birth date, how many went to Eton, or how many were in Rome. So you can start to navigate what was a static, incredibly rich reference text in asking dynamic questions that will show you progressively different people and different combinations of travels, motivations of travels, and trends of travels. I want to give you an example of what working with this type of data allows us to think anew about the world of the Grand Tour. What happens when exactly, as I just show you, and in the Q&A I can also show live, a researcher can simultaneously query by time, place, or biographical information, asking, for example, when someone was in a certain city at a certain time, or what people attended a certain college, or who were the travelers who were in the company of women or with tutors, etc. So the example I'll give you is the one on architecture and the Grand Tour. And I chose to focus on the architects because it was the architects who produced the documentation of archaeological remains crucial to classics in the 18th century, even before the word archaeology existed or was used widely. So I show you slides that I show my students sometimes when I try to give a sense of how revolutionary travel was in the 18th century in the understanding of classics. What you see here is various images of the Parthenon in Athens. On the bottom right, you see two images that we recognize and are useful that are both, well, now a lot of like the mosque inside the Parthenon has been destroyed, but this is what you see is pretty much the Parthenon as we recognize. You can recognize this as the Parthenon, as you also can still see in Athens today, and as well the architectural details we recognize from how we study the Parthenon today. But these images came out only at the very end of the 18th century. Until that point, the only image of the Parthenon that widely circulated was this, you see the Temple of Minerva, which was from a late 17th century travels by Spon and Wheeler to Athens, which is on the one hand incredible because it shows the Parthenon before the bombing that destroyed it. And on the right top side, you have the account of the bombing in 1687 that destroyed much of the Parthenon during a war between Venetians and Turks. But on the other hand, it's a tremendous lack of details, a very fanciful representations of the figurative representations on the Parthenon, and really this tiny, tiny image. So what happens with travel in the 18th century is tremendously influential in how people came to understand antiquity. And here I will talk about Paestum later on, and I just want to show you what it meant to be an architect in the 18th century. On the top right, you have two architects at Paestum that are taking measurements to draw scientifically the columns, and it was not easy, and I think no one would want to be up there with them. But also this was an incredibly scientific, precise, and also creative and artistic moment. And if we think still of Paestum, the Greek site 80 miles south of Naples, Piranesi made this, at the end of his life, this tremendously beautiful and compelling and haunting images still now. But, think of the Parthenon, but think of the temples of Agrigentum or the Diocletian Palace in Spalato, or even precise image with precise measurements of Roman antiquities in Rome. It is the architects in the 18th century that first put this together for us and furnished the foundations of archaeological studies that we have become familiar with since. So what I did is that I studied the 69 architects in the database who traveled to Italy in the 18th century. And this is work that appeared in the American Historical Review already. And you can also check, Megan, can you show the second link, please? As an interactive visualizations at leisure at another time. So these are the 69 architects. And what we did, and this is the interactive visualization you can access yourself. And this is at the core of it, a timeline that shows all the data that we have about these travelers, places of visits in Italy. So let me tell you a little bit what's going on here. Each line represents a different architect's travels. They are all lined up, starting at the same origin point on the left, but vertically they are organized in chronological order to represent the order of occurrence of these travels throughout the century. Horizontally, instead, what you see is the extent of each trip, with the different colors indicating different regions visited. Green is for Veneto, the Republic of Venice, blue is for Naples and the Neapolitan Kingdom, and red is Rome and the Papal State. What you also see on the left-hand side is the absolute days of travel following the names of the travelers, and they're organized by decades in this line. What this allows you to see immediately is how many more traveled after 1750. From 1750 to 1790 is when most travel happened. An important thing that is always crucial to remember is that what we have and what we show is just what is preserved in the data. It doesn't mean that there were more travelers or more places traveled. And with visualizations and data visualizations have this absolute compelling implicit sense of seeing everything, but one always has to remember that is with every historical study, what we show is just what we know, that not what actually happened. In the live interactive version at the link that was given, if you move the cursor on the timeline of any traveler, you can get specific information about the place and time of visit that's represented. And in the search box above, you can also search by a person's name, which I will highlight the single timeline, or by a place. So what does these visualizations allows us to see? Here, I did put Paestum. And we've been talking about Paestum, the Greek site south of Naples, as an incredible important one for rediscovering of classical Greek architecture in the 18th century. So now you only see the architects who we know to have gone to Paestum. And you can see that this happens mostly in the second half of the century. And in fact, the discovery of Paestum is said to be only in 1754 for modern architects. What happens if we put Rome? Rome prevails, like red is the dominant color in this. And in fact, what you come to see is almost that it's almost as a prerequisite to becoming defined as an architect is to have visited Rome. Almost all the travelers went to Rome, and this is where they spent the most time. This is where they studied and socialized with other architects, is where they sought commissions, and given that often they didn't have much money to travel themselves, might befriend wealthier tourists to accompany on more extensive tours. So this dominance of red really reflects the fact that an 18th century architect visit to Italy was shaped by and large by being in Rome. What other patterns do we see if we go back to the overall image beyond the predominance of Rome? Can you see any other emergence of trends in architecture? And I think that there are certain things that you can actually see. If you look out for the green that dominates in the first part of the century, what you are seeing is really the time up to the early 1760s that reflect Palladianism of the early 18th century, when most of the classical inspirations came from visiting Palladian villas in the Veneto region. But the blue that dominates more and more in the course of the century really reflects the Greek revival, with more visits to Naples and the south, all the way to Sicily, to really get to know original monuments of Greek architecture. Could we even see maybe from this, who were the 16 of this, looking at these 69 architects, who were the ones who endeavored to visually document ancient monuments? And in fact, some of the less visited destinations in this time chart contain particularly compelling story. So if you click on destinations out of Italy, and this gray is very faint, the gray that you see here represents destinations outside of Italy. What you see here are the trips of 7 of these 69 architects that are those who traveled beyond Italy to places such as Malta, Dalmatia, where they found the palace of Diocletian, Greece, Egypt, and Turkey. And in fact, these are the ones, most of whom came to publish narratives, illustrated narratives of their travels, such as Stuart and Revet, whose images of the Parthenon I showed you previously at the end of, that came out at the 18th century. Adams, who published the Palace of Diocletian, Rieu, and others who traveled to places outside of Italy, trying to document anew this exciting discovery of classical Greek architecture. So it's almost if here you have a geography of publication-related expeditions that you would not find in any other way by just looking through the print dictionary. I will stop here because I want to get to the conclusions, but there is so much more that one can say by studying these visualizations. This is just about the travel and for geographical data of place of visits and temporal data of time of visits, but one can integrate this with informations about education, the background of these travelers before the tour, what the funding for this tour was, what about their employment before and after the tour and their achievements once they return to Britain. And really, as you will see if you access the study in the link, we really managed to tease out a all new way of understanding the dynamics of social mobility and family ties in the professionalizations of architecture in the 18th century, and how much this owed to travel to Italy and the documentation of its antiquities. But I want to turn to my conclusions, the last sections about digital history and the classical humanities. So the process I've been describing, the possibilities and challenges of doing historical research in the digital age, are what came out of our work with data and this project for more than 10 years. In a time of rapid digitizations and datification, as now has become a word. So now 10 years later of when we really started, on the other side of the social and technological ruptures entailed by a global pandemic and the spectacular rise of AI, the concept of data is at the forefront of essential conversations more than ever, both in the academy and beyond. From megabyte to zettabyte, the exponential growth of data represents, people think, a new structural condition. And along with this, the constructed nature of data is at the core of reflections about history in the digital age. What we wondered then is, can a study like the one we did for the Grand Tour, that is about thousands of people and not millions of people, can it still belong to conversations about big data? Can the 69 architects belong to conversations about data in the age of big data? So there are two ways to answer this. The first one is that 69 in itself is not a big number, the 69 architects I've been talking about. But if you go to any existing book on British architecture in the 18th century, the names that come up are maybe 5 to 10 and always the same people. While what happened by looking at 69 architects is really finding information about many more, like exponentially many more travelers, which came to include also the travelers who maybe became famous, as well as the ones who did not, the ones who didn't turn out to be architects in the end, the ones who did build buildings of note, but also the ones who wanted to and never succeeded to, maybe because they died young, but maybe because they were not successful, or life came and changed, life events intervened and changed their trajectory. So what we do get is really a fuller story of understanding how inventions and transformations happen with human agents in the process. The other way also that we have to think of these thousands of travelers in the project is that not for everyone we have the same amount of information. And this is what the slide is trying to show. This is an interactive visualization if you go to the book. But what's most important is not the completeness of the data sets or how large it is, but for doing the kind of historical research that we are invested in, the most important thing might well be the question of how complex the relationship between different layers of data is. What do we know about the women, which are here in orange, versus the men, which are here in green? So you immediately see that for the women, we have very little or no for most of the women, we have no information about occupation and education. And this is an immediate reminder that women were not admitted in universities even at the time. But it's also then becomes something that you see in the data that then prods you to ask different questions. How did they get learning? How did they interact with this classical sites? How did they educate themselves outside of institutions? And how come that what does it mean that some of them, we might not have any information about data, but they are among the ones who travel to most places, as you see in this other bit, connecting women to places of visits. So it's more than in absolute numbers, it's precisely in this complex interlaying of informations that you get to do rich data rather than just big data research for the humanities. And what also comes out of a work like the biography of 69 architects is the concept of collective biography, which means to take into considerations multiple people that you can aggregate together at the same time, which is precisely what this database allows you to do. And what happens by considering both the famous and the less famous is something where I go back still every time to a quote from Virginia Woolf from The Art of Biography in 1939. The question now inevitably asks itself whether the lives of great men only should be recorded. Is not anyone who has lived a life and left a record of the life worthy of biography? The failure as well as the successes, the humble as well as the illustrious, and what is greatness and what smallness? So these questions are questions with not obvious answer, but questions that one has to take up as a scholar in trying to think about the people who cared to travel or were involved in travel and in caring about antiquity in the past. And it's only through a database that allows you to see at the same time the famous and the not famous that you can even begin to ask these questions. And as in the case of the architects, thinking about both the famous and the not famous, the one who made it and the one who failed, the one we forgot and the one we remember, that I then also think we get closer not only to a history of those who have been deemed worthy of remembrance, but to the fuller potentiality of the past. And here, for me, it's important to go to a quote from the scholar Sabina Loriga, where she thinks of collective biography as a space where what matters is variety. And as she says, it's only through a multitude of experiences that will enable consideration of two fundamental dimensions of history, that is conflicts and potentiality. And I really think that a digital approach that allows us to take into considerations exponentially more people than we've used to, we can start to ask anew these questions. And in real conclusions, let me just say about where does classics fit in all of this? I'm here back to a painting that is a defining painting of 18th century Grand Tour. If this does not happen, this is not a painting set in Rome or in any Italian destinations, but is a painting by Zoffany depicting the British collector Charles Stanley surrounded by his favorite items. Most of them, all of them, resulting from his grand tours, travels, and connections. So this is another group portrait, like the one we saw of the 6 British men in Rome, in conversational style. And it's a famous painting that once again shows elite British men among classical antiquities, this time transplanted onto British soil. Townley was indeed amassing at the time what would become one of the largest collections in Britain. All the pieces in the painting are accurately depicted and easily recognizable, but for the fact that Zoffany has imaginatively assembled them as to crowd the library, while in fact they occupied various places in his house. His house served as a museum during his life. And then this donation, the Townley donation to the British museums, is the biggest donations ever of classical antiquity to the museum in a single swap. What Vicky Kontman, though, has recently also done by digging deeper into this picture of striking contrast between the colorfully dressed elite males and the pale and lucent stone objects and naked marble statues among and around them, is to put this conversation style in relation to another one that just a few years earlier by Richard Causeway, which is again Charles Townley with a group of connoisseurs, much less idealized, and in fact, an image that really speaks to contemporary correspondences that Coltman has uncovered, highlighting the homosocial and erotic tensions that underline, in fact, both scenes. So connecting the library scenes and with the naked statues and the dressed men to this much lewder lecture. The title is Lewd itself, under the rubric that she calls the sex and the antique. Yet again, we have here a crowded scene in which much is missing, from the actual women that inhabited this world to the various intermediaries who made the transportation of these works back from Italy to England possible. But this is the fuller story, including all these other people, is precisely the real story of how so much classical antiquity came out of Italy to the world and to occupy our study till to today. One of the Townley's main suppliers was none other than the Italian artist Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who I mentioned before, which is striking, haunting, amazing depictions of the temples of Paestum. Piranesi sold to Townley both pair of Roman altars from the Palazzo Odescalchi during Townley's first trip to Italy in 1768, Etruscan vases on his second trip in the early 1770s, and the colossal marble head of Hercules that was found on Adrian Villa during his final visit in 1777. And these objects that Piranesi supplied to Townley, along with 8,000 others in the collection, are the ones among the ones who eventually made their way to the British museums. Piranesi himself was actually not from Rome, but from Venice. But he moved to Rome as well because of the Grand Tour, because it was a favored destination for artists from all over Europe on account of its art and ancient remains and on account of its crowds of tourists and possible patrons. In Rome, Piranesi became one of the most influential visual interpreters of Italy's antiquity, shaping its imagination and study in ways that reverberate still today. His engravings, highly sought after by grand tourists for their visionary character, continue to raise questions of scale and representations, though, that go to the heart of the Grand Tour and of classics as a discipline. A recent Morgan Library exhibition has shown how Piranesi always chose to insert into his engravings real people that he observed and drew himself, whether they were workers in his print shop or people he encountered on the street. One place that Piranesi returned to again and again was the Cestius Pyramid in Rome, and where he used a human figure both to measure the physical scale of the monument and to suggest, metaphorically, the immense scale of history. And here I collated 4 of the existing depictions by Piranesi of that most striking place and monument in Rome of this pyramid, and used, like, these are small, but you will see how these people everywhere are not just stock figures, but they have an individuality as well as a way to represent the scale of the monument and the scale of history and passing of time. 250 years later, the African-American multimedia artist Carrie Mae Weems arrived at the same site during her time as a fellow of the American Academy in Rome in 2006, a latter-day participant in the tradition of artists on the Grand Tour. Carrie Mae Weems is aimed for beautifully arresting and haunting works such as the Kitchen Table series, the Louisiana Project, and the recent retrospective entitled Witness, all of which turn an explicitly Black gaze on the fraught history of race in the US. But in Rome, Weems created the series Roaming by photographing various Italian sites from Rome as far as south as Matera. Always in black and white, her image invariably include in the frame the solitary figure of a Black woman seen from behind in a long black dress. So conducting her own classical journey in the early 21st century, Weems puts these words to explain this figure in a painting. I call her my muse, but it's safe to say, and I'm quoting her word now, that she's more than one thing. She's an alter ego, my alter ego. Yes, this woman can stand in and for me and for you. She leads you into history. She's a witness and a guide. So Weems' image of Cestius' pyramid directly evokes the many 18th century images like Piranesi's, the documented Rome's monuments with quasi-photographic precision and deliberately set the diminutive human figure in relation to these monuments. Weems' muse can also serve as a guide for rescaling the history of classical travel, inspiring the recovery of previously obscured or forgotten figures within that history. At a moment when many would like for the humanities, and the classical humanities in particular, to expand their range and to become more inclusive, digital tools that allows us to glimpse the many thousands of people, humble as well as illustrious, who roamed among Italy's antiquities, if used thoughtfully and with an allowance for absence and uncertainty, might be, I suggest, one way forward. Thank you for listening to me sharing all this experience and images. And if there is time for questions, I'll be very happy to entertain them. And also in the future, please feel free to write to me if exploring the book or others, you have ideas, questions. So it doesn't need to be limited to today, our conversations, but I hope we have some time now. Thank you, Megan, and everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand feature or you can also just feel free to jump in.
I see a question is about my email, so I just put it in the chat. And any question is a fair game from I know that I put a lot here from 18th century travels, classics, the digital part. So I tried to put together a lot. It is been a privilege of this digital publication that I could combine both scholarship and educational tools and essays by others all in a single package. But there is a lot in one set. Oh, I see there is a hand. Phoebe, would you?
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, my video is not working, but yeah, this was a fascinating presentation, and I'm really excited about using this tool. And I do have one question, maybe kind of a silly question, but I wondered if at some point you would think about possibly expanding this database to include fictional depictions of the Grand Tour. What are the possibilities there? How could this maybe complement the kind of actual, the data that we have about real travelers?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that's a great idea. And in fact, when you say fictional, can you give me an example or not? But I will answer meanwhile, but I hope I don't go off topic. Which ones did you have in mind?
Yeah, like maybe thinking of, I guess, Forster's novels or yeah, they're like kind of novelistic version.
Yeah. Okay. So that's definitely worthwhile. And actually, you just gave me a very good idea, because I said, like, because I use this tool in teaching. And one advantage of using it in teaching is also that you get, at least I do at Stanford, as you know, we have a lot of computer scientists. And some of them are really interested in the humanities and in classics, but they also don't have an easy point of entry. And I found that given that I give them data, they immediately feel more comfortable. And then through the data, I bring them to read 18th century accounts. And then they start doing sometimes incredible work, and I show you in a moment. But it is true that some of the work, because the publication of the book includes also work that the students have done in the class. But they always are hungry for more data. I mean, that's a problem that they, like, they, at first, they're even, a computer scientist is almost disappointed that there is only 500,000 data points in this database. They also, that's one of the big problem, I think, now with big data, that this is idea that big is better always. But I put them to work, especially in relations and doing analysis of texts that are 18th century digitized text. But if I were to ask them to think about fictional grand tour novel, and I saw more even coming later, it would be easier to expand the set of text that they could use as digitized text and data. And the ones that you mentioned are 19th century, but those are also easier to come across. So I should expand and suggest them to look into, like, putting, like, now that they have this data about the 18th century, it would be easy for them to work on extracting data points, locations, entity, do sentimental analysis, all these things that are very well versed of doing with later and different and fictional accounts, and think about how do you imagine that what does it mean when you start to compare what comes out of fictional accounts with the data that we have from archival and historical sources. So that's a very good idea. I find another of the questions in a way similar. Paul has asked in the chat, have you compared these tours with the travels of Syriac of Ancona? And Syriac of Ancona, of course, is also the first person who gave us an image of the Parthenon, which was in manuscript, not even printed. So in that case, both the transmission and dissemination of the image was difficult or challenged in ways that we have such a hard time imagining, coming as we do from a photographic and digital age sense of reproduction. But that would also be the case of getting the data out of the database and then putting on a map that we have done a few times, and tracing, and instead the travels of Syriac. The question then would be, what would, I mean, if I were to ask a student, for example, to do this, I would say, what's the question behind the comparison? What are you interested in? Are you interested in tracing if there was a sense of the importance of Syriac's travels, and therefore are you trying to trace an influence of what was known of Syriac travels on these other travelers? Or would you be interested in just comparing to see how different travels could be in the 18th century versus the early, I call Syriac early Renaissance, even if it's very early. But these are the kind of questions that I think having this information in data form can allow you to start thinking through. And they are research questions that, again, I go to the pedagogical because I admire so much what Paideia is doing, but I found this so powerful in connecting with STEM students who don't necessarily know or know how to access research and research questions in the humanities. And it's a challenge for us because some of these questions, I mean, I talk about the STEM students, but are real scholarly questions with tremendous potential to transform how we think of the history of classics and classical travel. So thank you for these questions that are also suggestions for more research. And Phoebe, did that answer? Yes. Yeah.
All right. I guess if there are no other questions, or if there are, feel free to jump in. But if there aren't, thank you so much, Giovanna Ceserani.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the possibilities for cross-pollination here amongst different research engines is really powerful, and you have at least what I've seen you show today excites my interest in looking into your site, but also seeing how it can be used to enhance, other study.
Mm-hmm.
Not just in Italy, but across the Mediterranean.
Yes, I'm also very happy that I have now concluded and published this, because it was a lot of work, and I also see I don't have now the slides. I didn't share the slides acknowledging how many people work with this and me, ranging from colleagues to researchers to technicians to so many students, graduate and undergraduates, and this has been long, so many of them now are colleagues and in their own jobs. And it's just like such a pleasure that to seeing how much this work, collaborative work, meant for all of them. But I think that you are completely right. The potential is also not only in a more like different ways to access the information in the dictionary, but now since this data form allows us to bring it into conversations with others. One thing I started doing just in the prosopographical realm, because that's where I've come to be a lot at this moment, is comparing who is in this database versus who is in the Dictionary of the National Biography. And it's so interesting to see, because if you look at 18th century lives in the Dictionary of National Biography, there are 20,000 people. So suddenly, the fact that we have 6,000, it's a pretty substantial and interesting comparative set. And of course, the difference is that the 20,000 18th century lives in the Dictionary of National Biography are all people who have decided that we have decided are important to be remembered. And then it's interesting to see what comes instead of these 6,000 that are there just because they were in Italy, traveling in Italy. So that's a way to compare two data sets. I would love to have, but there is another question that I have to be honest with, that there is a limit, is that of course, the British were not the only travelers, and Italy was not the only place traveled to. We could do this data-rich approach because of this dictionary that itself, and I have a hard copy here, like itself, this was the work of decades of a team of scholars. And I wish we had something like this for the French or for the Germans or for travels outside of Italy. And I do capture by name entity recognitions. We capture all the places that are mentioned that are known in Italy. And that's how we can see the traveler, the architect traveling beyond Italy. And we also capture people who are not British. But that there are plenty of like Germans, French, but it's not as systematic. And so it will be wonderful when we will have more data for these other sites. But also having, I think that I'm also positive about the fact that technology keeps advancing, sometimes in scary and maybe all too fast ways, but I can also see some possibility for future research that would help building database that concern other places and other nationalities, even if in the absence of such a rich structured resource as we have with the dictionary. Because in like the way we could do and name entity recognitions on the dictionary, we are getting to a point where that can be done on archival material, on less structured books. So I think it will become easier, Paul, if I may say, to do the kind of comparative work that will be exponentially really expand this world in a very, very interesting way. Does that answer the question?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I have to go, but
Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
All right. Thank you so much, Giovanna Ceserani, for this wonderful lecture, and thank you to everybody who came and asked questions. And I hope that everybody has a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Megan. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.